Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the webinar series here at the Center for Professional Selling at Ball State University. I am the host, Deva Rangarajan, and we are privileged to have a repeat guest out here, one of the only guests who is doing our series for the third time, Ms. Karen Mangia, who is the VP of Customer and Market Insights at Salesforce. And not only is she a very high-ranking individual professional at Salesforce, but she's worked with AT&T before, Cisco before, after doing a couple of degrees from Ball State, and she is a super productive writer. So not only does she have a day job, but she does a fantastic job on writing books, which I think are personally relevant, either if you have to look at work-family balance and how do you need to take care of yourself, or she has another wonderful book where we just had an interview where she talked about how do you work from home and how do you be productive either as an individual or as a leader. But now moving into actually in her role as in charge of customer and market insights, she has a book which is again called Listen Up, how to tune into customers. I guess this is more in line with your job, how to tune into customers and turn down the noise. So Karen, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us again.
My pleasure. It's great to be back.
Indeed. Karen, tell me a little bit more about this book, Listen Up. So what is it about?
Listen Up is all about how to really lead and listen with a beginner's mindset, which I think takes discipline and it takes practice, especially if you've been doing the same kind of work or perhaps meeting with the same kind of customers for a number of years.
Yeah.
And the book is all about, how do you do things like unlock innovation with your customers? How do you find a path forward when the inevitable disruption happens, whether that's a financial crisis, a pandemic, or otherwise? And it's also all about how to really bring the voice of the customer live into your business so that everybody has the opportunity to hear it.
Now, one of the chapters that immediately caught my eye was don't bet on your blind spots, right? And there is so much tendency for us to be so myopic. In my opinion, one of the best articles written in marketing is called Marketing Myopia by Theodore Levitt. And he very famously said, no customer wants a quarter-inch drill. What they want is a quarter-inch hole. And the idea is that don't be too myopic in your vision. So tell me about this. Don't bet on your blind spots. Tell me about what this chapter is about.
Well, it's an opportunity for me to introduce you to a guy who I find very fascinating. His name is Ashley Revel, and I would consider him kind of your regular neighborhood guy.
Yeah.
He has a job. It's not a great one, but it's good enough. And one evening, he's at a pub with his friends having a pint, and as people tend to do at times, he started getting a little bold and putting out a scenario where he imagined a different life. And at one point he asked his friends, what would happen if we went to Las Vegas and I put all of my life savings on one number on the spin of a roulette wheel? And his friends were, postulating, different scenarios, and you wouldn't do it. And he leaves the pub and he starts thinking about it and he takes inventory. He has a nice watch. He has a nice car. He has some nice golf clubs. And he says, why not? He literally sells all of his earthly possessions and also does a little bit of fundraising. And by the time that he flies to Las Vegas with his friends, he is wearing a rented tuxedo because he sold most of his clothes. So now imagine he walks with his friends, up to the cashier's booth, turns in literally his life savings and gets those chips back. So he walks through the casino. I mean, you can just picture the tension, right, hanging in the air. And I'm sure brief moments of wondering, like, how did we get there? So he goes up, he sets the chips down. You hear the clink and you hear the croupier say to him, okay, you have to call it while the ball is spinning, red or black. And he calls it out. And when I think about that, if this were my best friend or my brother, what would you say? I mean, I would say, you're crazy. Don't do this. And yet every single day, CEOs and leaders in organizations do this. They bet on a blind spot called Net Promoter Score. They take one number and one question, and they bet entire businesses on that number. And I think that's a significant blind spot, because what often happens is people discover that you can have healthy numbers and unhealthy customer relationships. And the only time that epiphany comes to light is when you have a retention issue and perhaps you lose your biggest customer.
So if that is the case, so what would your recommendation be for them? So do not rely just on one score. What would your recommendation to be to those kind of leaders or even individuals, right? It could be that an individual might bet everything on one horse, not necessarily looking at, as you said, in this case, other options as well.
Use statistics and stories together. I think that's critically important. And I think it goes one step further, specifically because you mentioned leaders. I mean, most leaders in sales organizations or senior executives at companies have relationships with customers. And oftentimes senior leaders in businesses were fantastic sales leaders, and it's how they ended up there. And what that means is it's very tempting to rest on your relationships and trust that because you've known some customers through the years, that if there's a problem, they'll call you. I mean, if they're really thinking they're going to take all of their business somewhere else, they'll call you first. And I heard this story that was absolutely devastating from a CEO of a company in Boston who found out that a CEO she had known for a long time didn't call. He sent an email and said, "Don't bother coming back on Monday, you're fired," and wouldn't even return her calls. And so what happens is when a smaller percentage of your job full-time becomes spending time with customers, you start to use the data as a proxy to measure the health of those relationships. And that's why having multiple metrics, having multiple touch points, and literally doing the work to bring the voice of your customers live into your boardrooms and backrooms is so critical. I mean, when you have the opportunity to see trends of data, including, your retention numbers and your pipeline and your satisfaction and your customer effort score and then can actually hear recordings from customers of the experiences that they have, it's very illuminating about what that experience is actually like. And so I think it's a dangerous game to bet on one number because it never gives you the full story.
No, because when I was actually looking at and hearing what you're saying, and that's interesting because my area of research is exactly on this idea of the net promoter score and how you should not just fall in with that particular number, because there could be many reasons why that number could either be bad or it could be looking great, but you have customers are not happy. And a lot of times, in my opinion, it's probably because you have a very siloed organization and there's not much alignment. And lo and behold, one of the chapters you have is that you have alignment issues in organizations. So tell us a little bit more about how you have the voice of customer that you're talking about, and you have an organization that might not be ready for it because they're not aligned. So tell us a little bit more about what should an organization do to try and get away from the siloed mentality and try to say, you know what, there are many things happening out there that could lead to us being successful in reaching the needs of the customers.
Well, to someone who only has a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right?
Yes, that's true.
And so I've experienced this phenomenon before where, you go in to have this conversation, you've prepared so much for the dialogue with the senior executive, and you go in and say, "I'm here to share with you the voice of the customer." And the executive gives you a blank look and says, "Somebody was just here talking to me about that topic." Well, the reality is the voice of your customer a survey? Is it the renewal statistics? Is it the win-loss data? Is it the scores from the most recent customer advisory board? I mean, the reality is the voice of the customer is distributed throughout the organization, and it's not the responsibility or sole ownership of a single team to know what that is and measure it. I think that factor is compounded with the dynamic that teams that listen to customers and measure them for a living tend to sit in a different part of the business very frequently from customer success or from customer support, who are getting a very different lens on the health, well-being, and needs of customers. And so there has to be a point where that information converges.
Absolutely.
And there has to be a way where you focus the company in on the very short list of the priorities that matter most to your customers and what each person in the organization can do to play a role in solving for that, or adding value, or adding more context to those stories or aspirations or priorities.
Now, one of the things that you talk in your book is you talk about the digital divide, right? So in your opinion, there's all these things about digital transformation, the customers having more access to voice their frustrations, or looking at multiple ways by which trying to gauge what the customer is saying. To what extent do you think that, from the viewpoint of a supplier organization, how tuned in should I be to this idea of the digital divide? How should I harness the digital divide to try and make it work for me as an organization?
Well, what I say is the sunlight often shines through the cracks when a strategy is forced into execution. And one of the phenomenons that has happened with this global pandemic is so many organizations were forced into digital customer journeys almost exclusively and in an instant. And whether that is your customer support organization or whether that's your own employees, what's happening is people are discovering that that digital strategy has lots of holes in it and the sunlight shining through. So the reality is, I mean, technology can either unite or divide, right? So the best digital strategies help companies get closer to their customers at scale and in a more personalized way. A digital transformation strategy or tool or technology that isn't fully deployed or adopted or working across an entire process ends up taking people further away from their customers as opposed to closer to them. And one of the things I find so interesting is, as people are struggling with overwhelm and overwork, automation and digital tools can be wonderful ways to offload work that people are doing and help solve for the overwhelm and the burnout. The reality is you have to have a cohesive answer to this question. And it's, what problem is our digital strategy or this digital tool going to solve for us and for our customers? And most people jump to, oh, digital is the solution, without really understanding the problem they're trying to solve. And then we're right back to that, if I have a hammer, everything's a nail.
Indeed. And I love this. So I think that was my take on this chapter on better questions, because the idea is that what should this technology be helping us out with? But what's the underlying problem, right? Wouldn't you say that before we jump into technology, there's a reliance? So one of my other favorite articles ever written, in my opinion, was this article called Avoid the Four Perils of CRM. This was a Harvard Business Review 2002 article written by folks from Harvard and Bain, I think. And to this day, I can replace CRM and move that with the digital transformation. And the findings are still the same. Not having a very clear view of what we're going to be doing with it, without asking the right kind of questions, could lead to very wrong answers, where technology is the key to everything. And I love essentially what you just said, is that ask the right kind of questions. Am I right in understanding that that's how I should be interpreting what you're saying here as well, right? Ask the questions. What is the problem? What are we doing out here? And then look at what processes, and then let's look at technology.
People before processes. I think that's so critical. And I think back when you were saying that to my first job in sales, and I'm not sure you and I have discussed this before, but I became a very accidental salesperson because when I was working at AT&T, they offered early retirement, and suddenly there was this customer set that they asked me to cover while I was doing project management as my day job. And it sounded so glamorous. It was called the STAR module. And doesn't that sound fabulous? I think actually that stood for small, troubled, and risky. These were customers that no one wanted. They were in scary office parks. They did not spend a lot of money. And what I discovered was very few of them returned calls. Mm-hmm. I will never forget, though, going into my first official sales call, I'm, carrying my briefcase that has the all-important proposals inside of it. You know the drill. Mm-hmm. And I go in and sit down in this kind of rickety conference chair that's keeping me off balance. And I pull out the proposals and hand them to the customer. And as they start to look through them, I proceed to read to them from the printed proposal. Mm-hmm. And what's so shocking is, after doing that, I won the business. I mean, how did that happen? Oh. It's because for all of the things that I got wrong, and believe me, the list was long, I got one thing right. I listened to the customer very deeply. Because I actually did have a beginner's mind. I had never met with a customer in that context. So I asked a lot of questions, and I was deeply curious about the answer. So the only part of that tragic template that I downloaded and customized was the list of the challenges the customer was trying to solve,
Yeah.
how my solution would do that and the outcomes they would realize. And it took me years into my sales and sales leadership career before I realized how difficult it is to really hear a customer as if it's the first time that you've ever heard that complaint or that opportunity. Because just like the digital tools, we want to jump to the solution, the thing we're going to sell them.
Indeed.
And I think that is the discipline of the beginner's mindset, which is forgetting everything that you've heard and think you know so that you can hear and discover something new. And that's what good questions do.
And that's actually one of the chapters in your book. That's what I love it. One of the chapters in your book is that go in with the beginner's mindset. But the fact is that you could go in with the beginner's mindset, but you should combine that with parking your ego at the door, right? Because at the end of the day, you go in and you are actually under the impression that, hey, listen, I've talked to 5 bigger companies than that particular customer. I know exactly what the needs are going to be. And then you go in with an ego that here I'm coming from this big logo of this label, but then you're going to be schooled by a customer for whatever it is. So tell me a little bit more about why is it important that when I'm listening to a customer that I should set aside my ego, that I might not hear like what I'm hearing from the customer, either about me or my organization, or all the things that I've held dear, all I hold sacred right now is completely flying out of the window because the customer is saying something else. So tell us about the importance of parking your ego at the door, because that's one of the things you mentioned out here, right? Is park your ego. You call it the secret sauce.
Yes, I do call it the secret sauce. It's, taking ego out of the conversation is very difficult because what happens is the more you progress in your career, or perhaps the bigger the company you work for, the more it reinforces the belief that you're an expert and that you know. And all of us as human beings like to hear good news. And all of us like to hear data that aligns with our preconceived notions.
Absolutely.
It's very validating and it reinforces how brilliant we are and how right it is that we have these high-ranking jobs. And the challenge becomes how many companies miss opportunities or miss signals. Either the market is shifting or their customers about to shift because they keep listening for the message that they want to hear instead of the one that the customer is delivering. And something that I found that's a remarkable tool to help take ego out of the conversation is those call recordings. There's a wonderful leader named Amy Brown. She has a company called Authentic CX. And she does that. She takes data and shows the themes of how the business is trending and the health of the customer relationships. And then she plays actual audio recording interviews from one-on-one conversations in the call center to underscore the point. And I mean, she has watched and describes the people taking their glasses off and fist slamming on the table and people screaming, no one's having an experience like that with my company. And it's not because there hasn't been ample data. It's because there's something about hearing it.
Yeah.
There's something about that moment when you hear a customer who is not getting the level of experience, when you are falling short of expectations, and experiencing that is something that only comes to life and I think prompts people to put ego to the side when you hear from a real person. Very few people look at a number and have the same reaction of taking their glasses off and screaming, I hope no one's having an experience like this with my company.
Indeed. No, because that is very interesting. Let's say you park the ego, you've heard the customer, and now suddenly it's not going the way you want. And now suddenly you have to deal with completely changing the way we're working. We have to disrupt the existing way of working. Tell us a little bit more about this idea. Say I am, as a leader, I'm going through all this. I'm trying to interact with my customers. I'm realizing that, hey, we are not doing as well as we're supposed to do. It's the same executive who hears that interview, bangs his or her hand or their hand on their on the desk. Now they have to deal with the way of disrupting their existing way, actually disrupting what they're, going back to your earlier book, disrupting their routines. So tell me a little bit more about how do you deal with disruption?
I was thinking about a time when I was brought in to have a conversation with a very big company that's in the B2B space. And this was their dynamic. I mean, they were considered a market leader and a recognized brand. And they were starting to have a significant amount of attrition and customer complaints. And for a while, they were like, oh, it was a bad quarter, or we will rebound, or, we just need to find a new product to bring to market. And what they realized is that the real challenge that they were facing is that there were too many people sitting between the company and their end customer. And so in this model, what was happening was it was starting to get confusing for the customer about who they were supposed to go to get issues resolved. And you can imagine revealing this information to the CEO who's having to picture potentially unwinding a channel model, right? And is thinking of the layers of horror of lost business and headlines that no one wants to endure. And so they did something very smart. They kept peeling back the layers of what is the smallest pain point we can reasonably affect that will send the signal to our customers that I hear you. And we're working on it. And what they discovered was this. It's very interesting. It wasn't about the sales model. It was that they had an online community. And they would tell customers, hey, this is great. Go to the online community, post your questions. Other people from the community will help you respond. And oh, by the way, our customer service team will interface as well. Well, as they started going through that community data, what they discovered was some of the requests would go 72 hours or longer without anyone ever commenting. Most of the comments that eventually got made did not resolve the issue, and there was no follow-up. And what they realized was this: if they could do one thing, it was they would set a clear expectation with their customers that anytime they posted a comment in a community, they would get a response within 24 hours. That one small thing that they could implement immediately. They didn't need a new digital tool. They didn't need a new process, a survey, a study, recalibrating compensation, or firing their entire channel. What they needed to do was prove to their customers that they were making progress on making it easier to do business. And that ultimately ended up starting a small series of steps forward to transform their business model and ultimately save their customer base. But it didn't come from, a radical transformation and grand action. It was, what is the smallest step we can take that everyone can participate in that builds trust and demonstrates that this investment is authentic? And it shifted customer perception substantially. And the other thing too was their employees felt better because they knew what the expectation was and they felt like they could help.
Absolutely. And more importantly, they feel that they are not under the microscope and it's just not their fault alone. And that's what I think is really, really cool from that perspective. Now, one of the things you talk in your book as well is the idea of the customer advisory board. And this is something that I'm hearing a lot, especially when I deal and talk to a lot of customer success professionals, where they say, we want customers in our advisory board so that we can learn from them, we can interact with them, not just to fix bugs, but also to look for innovative ideas as well. So tell us a little bit more about how should I go about choosing the right kind of customers to be, because you could give everybody an option to sit on the board and then you're going to get pulled in all different directions. So how do you try to make sense of who do you want on your customer advisory board?
Customer advisory boards tend to work best when it's a group of customers who have something in common. It's either a common challenge, a common area of interest. They have a common job title of people in the room. It could be chief marketing officers, chief information officers, whatever that might look like. But you're looking for the common denominator of they have something in common so that you know who you're listening to and what you're solving for, because their needs and requests will certainly vary. The next piece of successfully architecting that is to understand that the word advisory is in there. And in order to get advice, you would have to not talk the entire time. And I watched this happen over and over as a challenge. We want to have an advisory board. Okay, great. They can be wonderful relationship deepening opportunities. They can help executives hear customers in new ways. It can spark remarkable innovation. But what your customers really want is two things out of those advisory boards. They want to build their own network of other people like themselves they can call when they get stuck or need ideas. And they want a backstage pass to your company. They want to go behind the scenes and say they saw something or experienced something that nobody else did or very few people did. And what ends up happening so often is instead, a company will bring in their executives, give presentations for hours on end. And there are companies doing this over Zoom as well, by the way, hours on end, and the customers never have a chance to talk. I don't understand what kind of advice that is. That is a customer information board. That's not a customer advisory board. So understand the intention and prepare accordingly, because part of it is knowing what do your customers want to hear from your company, not what is your company wanting to tell your customers.
Absolutely.
So start from the outside in and give your customers a chance to talk when they're there.
Indeed. And I think that's something that, let's say that you've done this and you realize that the customer is moving at a pace much faster than what your organization is prepared or is ready to move. Am I making sense out here? Because one of my other favorite books is Who Says Elephants Can Dance by Lou Gerstner Jr. So essentially, how did he turn around IBM, literally going from a product manufacturing company to more of an outside in? That's pretty much what you said right now. Yeah. Is how do I try to move at the speed of a customer? If, for example, if it's Salesforce, you're what? How many people? 150,000 people, maybe?
Or about 52,000. Yes.
So sorry about that. So I should have done.
That's okay. We aspire. We aspire.
So let's say you're 50. Now the question is that getting that moving 52,000 along the way, the customer's moving at a pace where you go like, how am I going to keep pace with that? With some customers, right? How do you try and build that momentum within your organization, trying to move at the speed of the customer?
By moving in much smaller steps.
Please explain.
Yes. And so, when I think about moving an elephant, to use your analogy, you can get an elephant from point A to point B. Yeah. You just do that one step at a time, and those steps are smaller than if you're moving a cheetah from point A to point B. Right? So understand how to break things down into smaller pieces and to rally every aspect of your organization and give them the power to participate. Yeah. And one of my favorite examples of this, USAA, has a wonderful patent tree that's in their innovation center, and they invite their employees to contribute ideas that can be considered for a patent. And the idea is to help solve customer challenges or bring new ideas to market. The person who holds the most patent leaves on that tree, the security guard at the front gate.
No way.
So tap into the people in your organization, which is all of them, who can unlock these moments of genius and see things that you don't see, and move in very small steps. I mean, big changes always result from all small steps.
Indeed. And I think that for me, that's one of all the kind of questions I get always from companies is that customers are moving at a much faster pace. But I say, for every customer like that, there are customers who are not moving at the pace that you are moving at. So essentially, you're going to have a mix of all of these, and you have to learn to deal with it as well. And for those customers who are way ahead of you, see how I can leverage my employees to get ideas to keep track of those. For the other customers, make sure you hold their hand and move them at the pace that you want them to be moving at. So for me, this book is, again, as I said, great insights. And I'm sure that for those people who want to actually try and take a look at this, there's going to be wonderful tidbits that they're going to have. I'm sure you have a lot of examples as well. So again, thank you so much for your time, Karen. I know that you have a lot more ideas. I'm looking forward to more books coming out of your other productive time. So if this COVID is going to continue, I can clearly envisage doing one more set of interviews with you at the end of the year with 2 other books. And essentially
a box set.
A box set. Essentially, that's pretty much what it is. Going all the way, right? So essentially going all the way from taking care of your health, then, hey, wait a minute, working from home, then listen up. You're working from home, but listen to your customers. Now going more into terms of how do you try to make sure, how do I start innovating using my customer insights? So I can easily see your next set of books. I can see where you're working on this. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and the audience as well. And I'm sure that for the audience, you'll benefit a lot from reading these books from Karen again. And I think, again, this is very, very insightful. And from my own personal perspective, this is exactly the area of research that I'm working on. So I look forward to more of your work, more of your blogs, and more of your posts on all the different social media as well. Thank you again.
Thank you.